Hello, we're going to talk about barriers connected with people who need drug and alcohol treatment and they're deaf. These individuals who may have grown up in hearing families, since 90% of families have deaf children who are hearing themselves, may have had different kind of communication issues. Think about yourself sitting at home, having dinner with your family, having the discussions that go on, watching television, communicating with brothers and sisters, and learning from these situations about maybe the dangers of drugs and alcohol. Think about growing up not getting that information. Additionally, when these deaf kids go to school, there is not in-depth prevention information provided. I worked at a school for the deaf for many years and know that deaf kids didn't have a chance to get in-depth prevention until maybe 8th or 9th grade connected with health classes. There's a lot of pressure placed on the schools for academics, reading, writing. So there may not be time in the curriculum to provide prevention information, which is so important and part of what happens in life, to learn about dangers of use. Also, we don't have access to prevention materials. We don't have a lot available, which is another reason why this isn't happening more frequently in schools. There are some materials that are available online related to prevention that's visual, but we need to develop more. There's not a lot out there. Also, there's difficulty with peer relationships. For example, in mainstream schools and deaf schools, peer acceptance can be challenging. And sometimes to get that peer acceptance, individuals are willing to go through very risky behavior and be the best, maybe even drug seller of all, whatever they need to do to be accepted. And actually, the Associated Press wrote an article talking about how drug dealers were targeting deaf kids because the police weren't always wanting to arrest them or give consequences. In fact, many deaf people report that maybe they've been driving under the influence and the police stop them and may not arrest them. Maybe they don't want to deal with interpreters. Maybe they don't think that these individuals will have a problem. But that kind of situation is not helpful for these individuals to learn about the consequences for their behavior. For all people, they need to learn about the consequences of their behavior, not just hearing people. And if you talk with many deaf individuals connected with their drug and alcohol use or those who have been in prison, many have been stopped while driving under the influence or had other interactions with police and not had consequences. Again, we see too much enabling kinds of behavior. With family situations, with social service agencies, teachers, police, etc., we need to really provide more education on why they need to hold people accountable if they're deaf. Another example, at the School for the Deaf where I worked, there was a group of students who were selling ecstasy to other kids at another school for the deaf, and staff caught them. The police were involved, and the police brought the group of kids to their office. Staff at the school assumed that they would contact the parents and that consequences would be given. That never happened. In fact, later that day, the police brought those students back to school and they said, "Oh, they're good kids, they won't do this again." So there were no consequences for their behavior. Another example, at the Minnesota program, we were contacted by police in another state who had arrested someone and they were actually in jail. And this individual had been driving while drunk and had an accident with another car and actually killed a police officer who was driving the other car. But this individual never saw what happened, didn't remember what occurred. He was in a blackout, which is when a person is awake, but they don't remember what happened. So when people told him that he was responsible for this accident and killing a police officer, he didn't remember. So they wanted to permit him to come to treatment instead of going to jail. Staff questioned him, talked with him, that person, in an interview situation, and clearly there was no remorse, didn't remember anything that had happened. And so we really felt it was best for him to have consequences of going to jail before he came to treatment, because he wasn't ready. The impact would not have been there for him if he came to treatment. He needed consequences for his behavior. So that's another example that I could tell you about the importance of consequences. There are times when parents might feel guilty. They might think that their deaf child's drug and alcohol use is connected to the fact they're deaf. They don't understand that it isn't connected to the fact that the person is deaf. So we have examples of parents with older deaf individuals who maybe have stolen money from those parents. One example is when an individual stole his mother's ATM card, and the parents didn't want to turn him into the police because they didn't want him to have a consequence and have to go to jail. How can this behavior be stopped if there's no consequence for that kind of behavior? So again, it's really important to give consequences for behavior. Sometimes you have to make sure it happens and create those consequences and not let it go. So we need to really provide more knowledge and support in the deaf community. Many individuals in the deaf community who go to social events have these events involving alcohol. A lot of them revolve around alcohol. So if there's someone who's sober and a deaf individual and still wants to have that social interaction and goes to an event and doesn't drink, people question, what's wrong with you? Why aren't you drinking? There's a negative stigma connected with not drinking in these situations. So there's a lot of pressure placed on deaf individuals who want to maintain sobriety. Other situations involve some deaf people who have attempted to go to college, and as you know, there's a lot of interaction with alcohol in colleges, and some of these individuals have had to choose sobriety and actually leave college in order to continue with being sober and not relapsing. There are some colleges that have set up sober dorms to try and be supportive, but we don't have enough of that going on a national basis in the schools that typically the deaf students attend to. So there's really also a lack of support in rural areas. You know, if you think about it, hearing people have a lot more options for treatment where they reside, but deaf individuals tend not to have that same support. Maybe there are some outpatient treatment programs around the country, but we don't have a lot of those supports. And if a person needs to get an assessment, it's very English dependent, and we have a lack of individuals who are really trained to give appropriate assessments. So it's one barrier after another that frequently happens for these people. Now, I'm part of a large grant that has been validating and translating from English to American Sign Language 10 different kinds of assessments or screeners, and they're connected with alcohol, drug, mental health, and career interest related kinds of assessments. Now, we'll talk about that more in class. You'll have a chance to learn a bit more about that. But for the most part, access is limited for assessments like this because of the heavy focus on English. And for many deaf people, it isn't appropriate to go through those kinds of assessments. Even if an interpreter is provided, they may not be familiar with vocabulary specialized related to drugs and alcohol. And so actually those assessments may not be a very valid instrument to use, and that's what the referrals are based on. Treatment approaches themselves often depend a lot on English. We don't have enough visual options for people or videos in American Sign Language to use in treatment. Currently, we do have more options available online, and the Big Book is available in American Sign Language, but we need more access. So if a person goes to a hearing mainstream program, maybe interpreters are provided, but typically it's for groups only. Think about all the unstructured time that goes on in the day. Think about hearing people in treatment eating together, learning from each other, learning from each other's experiences. And a deaf person is very isolated without the interpreter there all the time. That's why we need more specialized treatment options where all staff are fluent in American Sign Language, where individuals are able to be in group with other deaf people. So if an individual is placed in specialized treatment, there are still some issues. For instance, confidentiality. We know in the deaf community there's a lot of grapevine and gossip that goes on. And if a deaf person is placed in a specialized treatment program, they may know other people that are in treatment with them. They may know staff. Because of that, they may not have a lot of trust. They may fear the fact that they're going to share information about their experiences and them being in treatment and gossip. So we really have to spend a lot of time reviewing information around HIPAA and confidentiality and the fact that information won't be spread outside of the treatment and how important it is for them to be aware of that and for everyone to keep and maintain confidentiality. And if we have interpreters that are part of the staff and not freelance interpreters, we also want to make sure they're part of the team so that the deaf clients can't try and inappropriately try and share information with the interpreter thinking that that won't be shared outside. We make it very clear that if people talk about self-harm, that will be shared. So connected with treatment, another barrier that happens is funding. It's expensive to go to treatment. Many people, as I've mentioned, that come to treatment are on public funding, either Medicaid or Medicare. Now, Medicare, as mentioned, is federal funding. And technically, it is possible to go to any program that's considered acute care, typically hospital-based, such as Minnesota. And for many years, Medicare was accepted if people were able to come to Minnesota. Medicaid is state-dictated funds, and there has to be special permission for those clients to be referred to programs out of state. And that's possible, but it can be a challenge. Each state has different rules related to treatment and referrals and services, as well as how many days are permitted for people to stay in a treatment program. So again, we really need to work on many kinds of barriers that are happening for deaf people to have better access to treatment. So, in summary, we have a lack of awareness that really can lead to a lack of recognition of the problem. And we don't have enough programs available to serve deaf people on a national basis. We also don't have enough certified professionals who are fluent in American Sign Language and trained in the area of drug and alcohol counseling and assessment. As mentioned, deaf people don't always get appropriate consequences for their actions. And access to treatment can be an additional barrier. If they're not able to find treatment programs or aftercare support or 12-step meetings that are accessible, that can be a problem. It's been positive to see in the past year with COVID that there have been more and more 12-step meetings online. That's never happened before. There are more than one meeting available every day online if people are interested. Whereas when the meetings were live, a person was lucky to find a meeting once a week, and in some communities that have to drive long distances, which wasn't always possible. So during the class, you'll be learning a lot more about the barriers, how to address them, research that's been available, approaches that can be used when working with deaf people, as well as online resources, vocabulary if you're working in an interpreter or counseling role. So we'll be looking at a lot of that.